I first met Brother Joe, as I called him, I insisted on calling him that, in the late 1990s. And there were many things which immediately impressed me about him. One was his humility and his gentleness of character. That, I suspect, was just one of the reasons why he was loved by many of his students. Another characteristic was the time and care he invested in them. He remained very attentive to their needs, not just as students, but also as young people. Brother Joe also took the life of the mind very seriously, which meant he took Francisco Marroquín University very seriously and his chosen discipline of economics very seriously. As has been mentioned, he was a participant in Ludwig von Mises' New York seminar in the 1960s, and he wrote his dissertation under the supervision of another Mises student, Rabbi Israel Kirzner. Those of you who knew Brother Joe will recall his firm commitment to intellectual rigor, as well as his patience in explaining the genuine insights of economics into reality to those who knew little about economics or who were skeptical about the effectiveness of market economies. Most importantly, from the standpoint of the purpose of why we're here this evening, Brother Joe was very serious about his Christian faith, just as serious as he was about his commitment to the insights revealed by economics. And that, I would submit, is because he was concerned about truth, religious truth, philosophical truth, and economic truth. Theology, philosophy, and economics approach the acquisition of truth in different ways. But what unites them is the conviction that there is truth, that we can know it, and that all truth is one. Without that commitment to knowing truth and the conviction that there is truth and that we can know it, there would be no reason for Francisco Marroquín University, the Institut de Fe Libertad, or for us to be here this evening. Joe Keckeissen, as most of you know, saw himself as working within the liberal tradition of economic thought, something which he understood as embedded in the political tradition of what we often call liberalism. Now, I don't need to tell this audience that liberalism is a word that lends itself to many, sometimes even contradictory meanings. Both the philosopher John Rawls and the economist F.A. Hayek called themselves liberals. But it's hard to imagine two men with more different economic and political views. One way of understanding liberalism, at least the way I try to approach it, is to understand it as a rich tradition whose origins go back to the medieval period, which was further developed in the early modern period, and which received, in a way, a decisive shape in the late 18th century. This is a tradition which emphasizes constitutionally limited government, rule of law, a regime of private property, economic liberty, and a strong civil society. Liberalism is also a tradition that has had an ambiguous relationship with Christianity. The roots of liberalism, as I briefly described it, go back to the very Christian world of medieval Europe. But since the late 18th century, especially in continental Europe, the relationship between liberalism and Christianity has been marked by deep tensions and even considerable hostility on a number of occasions. There are many reasons for these tensions and conflicts, which I will not elaborate upon here. But there have been and are many Christians and liberals who have worked to overcome these differences, and Brother Joe was one of these people. There were also many others. In his opening address at the first Mont Pelerin Society meeting in the 1940s, F.A. Hayek, who's probably best described as an agnostic, lamented the history of hostility between continental liberalism and Christianity. Others, such as the ordo-liberal thinkers and economists Walter Eucken and Wilhelm Röpke, both of whom were devout Christians, sought to develop bridges between what they understood to be liberal ideas and the doctrines of Christianity. We can even go back to the Scottish Enlightenment, and here we discover that the vast majority of those involved in this intellectual movement were believing Christians. Many of them were Presbyterian Church of Scotland ministers. Tonight I'd like to draw attention to one such 19th century figure who sought to establish genuine dialogue and reconciliation between the claims of Christian faith and what he understood to be liberalism. One reason that I chose the subject of tonight's lecture, the Dominican priest Henri-Dominique Lacordaire, was that, like Brother Joe, he was a professed member of a Catholic religious order. Father Henri-Dominique Lacordaire is certainly not a household name today, but in the 19th century he was among the most famous Christian thinkers and preachers of his time. Living as he did in the wake of the various Enlightenments and in the aftermath of the French Revolution, the life and writings of Lacordaire reflect all the dramas of Christianity's ongoing, difficult, but inescapable engagement with societies shaped by the movements of ideas which emerged in the 18th century and which transformed the world, for better and for worse. Some of those ideas resulted in positive developments, such as the abolition of hereditary privileges. Other ideas, however, associated with some of the same movements, also brought many people to the guillotine. There's much that could be said about Father Lacordaire. These might include the reasons for his abandonment of the doctrines of Rousseau and his return to Christian faith as a young man. Another subject worthy of an entire lecture would be Lacordaire's famous Lenten lectures. Lent begins tomorrow, by the way. These exercises in Christian apologetics drew thousands of people to Notre Dame in Paris. They facilitated a revival in homiletics and led to Lacordaire being described as one of the greatest orators of the 19th century. Among Dominicans, Lacordaire is perhaps most famous for taking the initiative of re-establishing the Dominican order in France. In that regard, it's revealing that when Lacordaire wrote about this in the newspaper L'Univers, he made a point of stating that the democratic, bottom-up governance traditions of Dominican orders accorded with the spirit of the French Revolution. Now, at the time, this was a very controversial statement for a French Catholic to make. Many Christians, with good reason, associated the French Revolution with hostility to Christianity, with the wholesale theft of church property by revolutionary governments in the 1790s, the closure of monasteries and convents, the expulsion of religious orders, and the widespread persecution and murder of clergy following the promulgation of the Constitution Civile du Clergé in 1790. All these things and more, again with good reason, were associated by many Christians with the modern spirit of liberty. How Lacordaire, as a Christian and a priest, engaged with this post-revolutionary world, a world in which liberal ideas and institutions had started to flourish throughout Europe and North America, is the focus of my remarks this evening. Perhaps it was Lacordaire's decidedly non-clerical family background. He came from a family of middle-class lawyers, naval officers, and scientists. But his entire life was marked by an effort to bring the truths of Christian faith into some type of positive contact with the liberal ideas that proliferated in the 18th and 19th centuries. To Lacordaire's mind, there was no going back to a pre-revolutionary world. He also thought that the post-revolutionary world provided a context in which the church could shed many political and institutional associations that undermined Christianity's ability to evangelize. One of Lacordaire's first appointments after his ordination as a diocesan priest in Paris was to serve as a chaplain at one of Paris's most famous government schools, the Lycée Henri IV. The experience led Lacordaire to conclude that public education was fueling the de-Christianization of France. It was consequently better, he argued, for Christians to have their own schools, schools which he thought should be completely free of government supervision and government money. For the same reason, Lacordaire believed that Christian clergy should refuse the state salaries to which they were entitled under law. In 1830, Lacordaire argued that these salaries allowed Christian clergy to be, quote, preyed upon by our enemies, by those who regard us as hypocrites or as imbeciles, and by those who are persuaded that our life depends on money, end quote. Now, at this point, it's worth noting that relations between the church and the French state were governed during Lacordaire's lifetime by the Concordat, negotiated by Napoleon and Pius VII in 1801. The Concordat had restored the French church's unity with Rome. It also acknowledged that questions of faith and morals were outside the state's supervision. But it also conceded great control over the church's institutional life to the French government. This was not a coincidence. As Napoleon reportedly remarked to his brother Lucien Bonaparte, quote, skillful conquerors have not got entangled with priests. They can both contain them and use them, end quote. The Concordat and the considerable control which it gave Napoleon's regime over church affairs was maintained in place during the First Empire, the restored Bourbon monarchy, the July monarchy of Louis-Philippe, the Second Republic, the Second Empire, and the Third Republic, before eventually being unilaterally repudiated by the French government in 1905 with its law on the separation of church and state. Lacordaire's alternative to the Concordat is perhaps best described in the expression, a free church in a free state. Lacordaire understood very well that it's impossible to separate religion from politics completely. But he also believed that the type of association between church and state, which prevailed throughout most of 19th century Europe, was positively harmful to the church's freedom and its ability to spread the gospel. He noticed, for example, how state financing of the church made many clergy deeply servile to government officials, and that their political and even philosophical priorities tended to reflect the priorities of the state rather than the priorities of the church. As you can imagine, Lacordaire's proposals to eliminate these arrangements made him unpopular with many people in the church. In the first place, they displeased those many bishops and clerics who were very happy to be on the state payroll. Lacordaire's point, however, was that state financial support of the church, whether direct or indirect, had very negative side effects upon the life of the church, such as burdening the church with institutions which had become devoid of any actual religious content. That insight, I think, is surely of great relevance to the Christian church in many countries today. Another group displeased by Lacordaire's proposals for reform of church-state relations were those French bishops who maintained a Gallican view of relations between national churches and Rome. By Gallican, which is taken from the word Gaul, I mean the belief that the Pope's authority over the church in a given country should be limited by not only the authority of that country's bishops, but also the civil authorities of that same country. Those French bishops who had Gallican views were unhappy with Lacordaire because the free church envisaged by Lacordaire was also one deeply committed to ultramontanist views of papal authority. For Lacordaire was not just a strong advocate of religious liberty, he was an unabashed ultramontanist. That's a position which emphasized the authority of the Pope over and sometimes against that of all other bishops. But ultramontanism, we should remember, began as part of a movement to free the church from the control of civil authorities by attaching churches more closely to the Pope. Lacordaire's ultramontanism subsequently put him at odds with important figures like his own bishop, Archbishop de Keckeissen of Paris, who maintained strongly Gallican views. On the other hand, Lacordaire's free state, by which he meant a state which limited itself to ensuring freedom of religion, led to clashes with another set of Christians. These were those Catholics in France and Rome who associated, for good reasons, the idea of religious liberty with what we would call doctrinaire secularism. These Catholics were very aware that the French Revolution's conception of religious liberty amounted to the relegation of religion to the purely private sphere and the realm of mere opinion and subjective preference. This, I'd suggest, explains much of the hostility with which Lacordaire's initial forays into rethinking religious liberty issues were met by many in Rome. In that regard, it's striking to see the degree of compatibility between some of Lacordaire's propositions and those articulated in Vatican II's Declaration on Religious Liberty, Dignitatis Humanae. The strongest similarity is that neither Dignitatis Humanae nor Lacordaire's thinking about religious liberty make any concession to religious indifferentism or religious relativism. Both insist that the fullness of religious truth is to be found in the Christian Church. The most marked difference between Dignitatis Humanae and Lacordaire is that Lacordaire insisted on a sharper institutional separation of church and state. By contrast, the expression separation of church and state does not appear in Dignitatis Humanae. We do, however, see a stronger parallel between Lacordaire's views and the teachings of Vatican II about the order of bishops. Under the terms of the 1801 Concordat, the French state continued to control the nomination of Catholic bishops in France. The Pope then either confirmed or rejected the nomination. In Lacordaire's view, this practice needed to be terminated immediately if the Church was to be truly free. At the time, this was a somewhat radical proposition. Even many non-Catholic governments insisted that they had to have a role in the appointment of Catholic bishops. Even many Catholics simply accepted this practice as entirely normal. In its 1965 decree, Christos Dominos, however, Vatican II adopted a position that accords very much with Lacordaire's views on this subject. Christos Dominos teaches, and here I quote, "For the purpose of duly protecting the freedom of the Church and of promoting more conveniently and efficiently the welfare of the faithful, this Council desires that in future no more rights or privileges of election, nomination, presentation, or designation for the office of bishop be granted to civil authorities. The civil authorities, on the other hand, are most kindly requested to voluntarily renounce the above-mentioned rights and privileges which they presently enjoy by reason of a treaty or custom." End quote. Now, I apologize for the long citation, but I think it demonstrates that on the question of whether the state should have a role in the selection and appointment of bishops, Vatican II and Lacordaire are at one. I think it also raises questions, I'd suggest, about the Holy See's present outreach to China and the apparent willingness of the Holy See to allow the communist state some role in the appointment of Catholic bishops in China. In many ways, however, Lacordaire's forays into the subject of the right relationship between church and state were a proxy for his wider concern. And this was the relationship between, on the one hand, the world of religion, of Christianity, and on the other, the world which had emerged in the late 17th and 18th centuries, which laid a particular stress upon freedom and liberty and what we often call liberalism. A desire to realize a productive relationship between these worlds was shared by some Catholic intellectuals in the 19th century, like Lacordaire's friend and intellectual collaborator, Charles de Montalembert, but perhaps most famously, Alexis de Tocqueville. Tocqueville and Lacordaire knew each other very well. Following the 1848 revolution, for example, both were elected members of the Second Republic's Constituted Assembly. During this time, Tocqueville belonged to Le Parti d'Ordre, the Party of Order, which consisted of royalists and conservative republicans. In his recollections of the 1848 revolution, Tocqueville stated that he was disturbed by Lacordaire's decision to sit in his full Dominican habit among the Jacobin members of the Assembly. In other words, among the Assembly's most extreme left-wing and violently anti-Christian members. On the other hand, both Tocqueville and Lacordaire opposed the newly emerging socialist movement, as well as Louis-Napoleon Bonaparte's coup d'etat of 1851 and the subsequent installation of an authoritarian regime. I think, however, that there's something providential about the fact that when Tocqueville died in 1859, Lacordaire was appointed to Tocqueville's seat at the Académie Française. Even today, it remains the custom that the eulogy of a deceased member of Les Immortels is made by their successor. Delivered in 1861, Lacordaire's 9,000-word address, I would argue, represents one of the best analyses ever penned of the thought of Tocqueville, and by extension, of the problems and opportunities marking the relationship between Christianity and liberalism. It is an analysis to which Lacordaire added his own distinct glosses. I'd like to spend the rest of my remarks explaining some of the most important observations which Lacordaire made in this speech, which are especially relevant for our own time. To my mind, there are three such observations which merit our attention. In the first place, Lacordaire underscored the ways in which Tocqueville believed that the relationship between Christianity and liberalism had gone wrong. He singles out Tocqueville's belief that much of the spirit of liberty, especially in continental Europe, was, to use Lacordaire's word, infected with philosophical and religious skepticism. That is important, Lacordaire observes, because it raises the possibility that Christians might be able to embrace many of the institutions associated with liberalism if the same liberal institutions purged themselves of religious and philosophical skepticism. At the same time, Lacordaire argued that a skepticism-free liberalism might be less inclined to instinctive anti-clericalism and better able to recognize some of the ways in which Christianity, with its belief in a rational God, had helped to advance the project of freedom over the centuries. The second of Tocqueville's observations underlined by Lacordaire was how Tocqueville's most famous book, Democracy in America, had highlighted the problem of reconciling liberty with equality in the modern world. In Democracy in America, Tocqueville stressed how democracy's emphasis upon equality was becoming a threat to liberty. These worries on Tocqueville's part may have been further solidified by his experience of the socialist uprisings in Paris in June 1848, an uprising led by men who wanted to see an economic leveling of society, including, in some cases, the outright abolition of private property. In his eulogy of Tocqueville, Lacordaire also underscored the dangers associated with the desire to realize l'égalité absolue des conditions, the absolute equality of conditions. If anything, Lacordaire's critique of modern tendencies to understand equality as the leveling of all social, political, and economic differences is even stronger than Tocqueville's. It led not only to what Lacordaire called decadence, by which he seems to mean a society in which everyone is equally mediocre. It also, Lacordaire argued, encouraged demagoguery on the part of those who desired even more leveling and legitimized efforts to use the state to try and secure the complete economic security of everyone, something which inevitably, Tocqueville and Lacordaire stated, resulted in the destruction of freedom for everyone. But from Tocqueville, Lacordaire also drew the conclusion that the case of America showed that equality and liberty need not be at odds, and highlighted the role played by Christianity in mediating that relationship in productive and healthy ways. In America, Lacordaire stated, Christianity was free from the type of attachments to the state which existed between religion and the political sphere throughout Europe. This had liberated Christianity in America to play a major role in reconciling aspirations to equality and the yearning for liberty. In America, Lacordaire states, Christianity remained the primary source of the type of virtues that led people to use their liberty responsibly. Such responsibility included using their freedom to help those who faced economic hardship rather than abandoning that relationship to the state. But more fundamentally, Lacordaire pointed out, Christianity in America expressed conceptions of liberty and equality which were not at odds with each other. Christianity, Lacordaire states, had helped to create a particular spirit of liberty in America, one very different to the spirit of the French Revolution. Lacordaire summarizes this American spirit of liberty in 4 concise sentences. 1. The American spirit is religious. 2. It has an inner respect for the law. 3. It values liberty as much as equality. And 4. It regards civil and religious liberty as the first foundation for political liberty. These 4 principles, Lacordaire believed, had allowed Christianity in America to harmonize liberty and equality. It prevented liberty from collapsing into a type of hyper-individualism, because Christianity links freedom with responsibility. This was why the type of free associations in America that helped those people who were in need were almost always religious. In doing so, Christianity helped to preempt pressures to use the state to resolve such problems, thereby helping to ensure that concerns for equality did not degenerate into an ideology of egalitarianism. The third lesson, which Lacordaire drew from Tocqueville, is that just as the roots of liberty lie deep in history, so too do the roots of despotism and arbitrary power. In the latter part of his eulogy of Tocqueville, Lacordaire points out that while the French Revolution expressed deep-seated yearnings for freedom from absolutism, yearnings which in turn had arisen from Christian and Enlightenment sources, that same revolution also quickly developed into a form of tyranny and lawlessness. The reason for this, Lacordaire surmised, is that the trend to state centralization had been in place in France for more than 150 years before the revolution occurred. Here Lacordaire drew explicitly upon Tocqueville's L'Ancien Régime et la Révolution, a text which was then and is now far less known than Tocqueville's Democracy in America. According to Lacordaire, Tocqueville had shown that the ability of a society which valued liberty to maintain its freedom was heavily dependent upon the type of institutions and social habits which prevailed. In the case of France, Lacordaire wrote, complaints about the Ancien Régime had paradoxically gone hand in hand with a deep deference to the state, a deference shared and supported by many Christians. That created conditions in which France found it hard to avoid further centralizations of power despite the revolution's emphasis upon liberty. By contrast, the spirit of liberty in America was accompanied by deep, ingrained habits of free association. These went back to the British colonial period, but these habits had been primarily promoted and nourished by the existence of Protestant churches and other religious organizations which had kept their distance from state institutions. These not only limited state power, they also meant that Americans were less inclined to look to the state to solve their problems. It's worth reminding ourselves that when Lacordaire delivered his eulogy of Tocqueville to the Académie Française in 1861, it was in the conditions of the relatively authoritarian regime of Louis-Napoleon Bonaparte. At the time, basic civil and political freedoms remained limited. Indeed, many Catholic bishops were quite happy with the regime. Lacordaire himself had, like Tocqueville, completely withdrawn from political life after Louis Napoleon's coup d'etat of 1852 and he devoted himself to the education of young people. He continued to advocate for religious schools free of state money and state supervision, but found himself opposed both by the state but as well as many bishops at the time. There is, however, I think, a remarkable consistency about Lacordaire upon his return to the Christian faith as a young man, a consistency which became even more apparent once he became a Dominican. That consistency can be summed up in the 4-word motto for the newspaper L'Avenir, which Lacordaire helped to found in 1830 as a young diocesan priest. And those 4 words were Dieu et la liberté, God and freedom. For Lacordaire, a society that had God but wasn't free, Dieu sans la liberté, such as pre-revolutionary France, was a society in which servility and despotism would prevail. But, he said, a society that had liberty but which marginalized God, la liberté sans Dieu, like revolutionary France, or like much of contemporary Western Europe, was a society in which decadence and despotism would prevail. And perhaps most importantly, Lacordaire believed that the only Christianity capable of undergirding a free society was a Christianity which believed that there is truth, a Christianity characterized by clarity about what it believed, a Christianity that was fearless in preaching its beliefs, a Christianity which took reason seriously when explaining those beliefs, and a Christianity that never compromised those beliefs by trading in ambiguity. For Lacordaire, a Christianity which did none of these things was neither being true to itself, nor much help to free societies, nor likely to be of interest to anyone concerned about truth. But for Lacordaire, a Christianity which did all these things and more was a Christianity capable of revealing the full potential of human freedom and the ultimate source from which this liberty comes. Preaching that Christianity in and to the modern world was, by Lacordaire's account, the only Christianity worth preaching, the only Christianity that could lend strength and direction to freedom, and the only Christianity fully consistent with a free society. Lacordaire died at the age of 59 in November 1861, less than 10 months after he delivered his eulogy for his fellow liberal Tocqueville. His death was a great loss for Christianity, for liberalism, and for those who see themselves working in the realm of both traditions of thought. Lacordaire did, however, have the good fortune to be able to tell people what he wanted as his epitaph, that is, the form of words by which he wished to be remembered after he died. And those words were the following: J'espère mourir un religieux pénitent et un libéral impénitent. I wish to die a penitent religious and an unrepentant liberal. Those words are not an expression of defiance. They are the words of a religious believer who had spent his life combining faithfulness to religious truth with the insights into political, social, and economic truth that he believed had been captured and clarified by the liberal tradition. That, I'd suggest, is the legacy of Father Henri-Dominique Lacordaire for us today. It is also the legacy of our dear departed friend, Brother Joe Keckeissen. Thank you very much.